My name is John Joseph Whelan, Jr., called Jack, and my last name is spelled Whelan.
You corrected my pronunciation of your last name before we get into it. So how do you pronounce it again? One more time?
Whelan.
Whelan. Right. And what is your birthday?
September 11, 1930.
Where were you born?
I was born in Washington, D.C.
And tell me about your family when you were growing up.
My father was an architect, and my mother was from Virginia. They moved to Washington, where my father became quite well known and did many important buildings there. And I grew up as mostly on a street called Waterside Drive, which was on Rock Creek Park, and near the Kalorama area, which is where the great old houses, many were built, some designed by my father. We moved.
What was your father's name?
He was John Joseph Whelan. I'm a junior.
Oh, so you are the junior. You didn't tell me. And could you introduce some of the products? I mean, the houses and the buildings
Well, I think
by your father?
the one that's most well known now is Barack Obama's present home. But he did embassies and
What
legations.
embassy? What embassy?
The Norwegian embassy comes to mind.
Oh.
And I think he did a restoration for a house that the Russians occupied for a while. It was that sort of thing.
South Africa?
Wow, that's a very impressive.
We moved around a lot during the Second World War because he tried to get into the service, but his eyes were bad and he was too old. And so the Navy employed him to manage the construction of naval training stations around the country, and we went to those places. Mm-hmm. At the end of the war, an invention that my father had, which was essentially the building of the center of a house, you might say, the kitchen, the utility room, and a bathroom on an assembly line, and it would be trucked to a site, and you would build any kind of house around it. It was a way of reducing the cost and making housing happen faster, which was an issue at the end of the war. And we moved to Portland, Oregon, where a company bought the patent, and my father directed the development of it. And so I grew up, really, in Portland rather than Washington.
You wanted to be like him? You wanted to be an architect?
No.
No?
I really wanted to be a writer.
Oh.
And when I went to college, the English department disabused me of that bad idea. And
Could you elaborate? What do you mean by this?
disabused,
Yeah.
talked me out of it.
Okay.
And
How?
I chose architecture as a sort of backed into it. Well, I knew something about that, and that's how I got into it.
On the way to Sarasota from Orlando, I happened to read the writings of your, and
Yes.
I could tell that it could be used as a movie script, one of the series in Netflix,
Yes.
like a Band of Brothers.
It's an interesting comment. I'm trying to figure out as whether you're going to do a comic movie or a horror movie, but
I'm thinking about love stories, a series of love stories in the war. Tell me about your mom.
my mother grew up with a silver spoon in her mouth. She was the third daughter of four girls that were the children of a very famous engineer in his day, structural engineer, and he was responsible for the designing of the railroad systems for the B&O Railroad. He happened to be in Korea at the moment when the stock market crashed in 1929, and he essentially lost everything that he had saved. He wasn't able to get back to the country in time to protect himself. So my mother went from the silver spoon to something considerably less, but she married a man who was doing very well in Washington. She had all the manners of the Southern belle. She was a very beautiful woman. And I think in 1930 I came as an unpleasant surprise.
So tell me about your sibling, brothers and sisters.
I have a brother and a sister. My brother is 5 years older. My sister is 8 years old. I'm sorry, I've got it the wrong way. I'm 5 years older than my brother and 8 years older than my sister.
You want to change that age, right?
Yeah.
So what about the school you went through in
What about the what?
schools that you went through?
I started out, my first school was a French school. It was on Massachusetts Avenue in Washington, D.C., and it was a school for the children of the diplomats that had come from different countries. In those days, of course, French was a lingua franca, and so I started school speaking French. I can't say I was speaking French. As a matter of fact, I did so badly they had to tutor me through the first grade. And you don't know many people that have been tutored through the first grade, but in any case, I eventually went to a school not too far from where we lived. I could walk to it through Rock Creek Park, which had great influence on me. And then the war came, we started moving around, and I went to different schools. A junior high school in New Jersey, in Trenton, and finally went to high school in a public high school in Portland, Oregon.
So you're moving around, and when were you in Korea? When did you arrive in Korea? Do you remember the exact date?
No, I couldn't begin to recreate those dates, but
approximately.
It would have been in the fall or late summer of 1951 or 2. Was it? Two. Okay, thank you.
Oh, you were in the boot camp in the spring of 1951, so it should be 1951, late summer or fall of 1951, right?
I would think so. I'm trying to think. I was halfway through my junior year, which would have been 1951, and I think, therefore, 1951, sometime in the late summer, fall, I entered basic training and went overseas around Christmas time.
Oh, we'll go back to that, okay?
Sure.
Hold on. And when did you graduate your high school? What year? 1950?
48, maybe?
48? And what did you do after that? You went to college, right?
I went to Princeton. I was surprised they accepted me. I did not have a very impressive academic record. And I can remember, it's a story I like to tell, of the dean of admissions coming to Portland and asking me why I wanted to go to Princeton. And I told him that my father had said I could go anywhere I wanted to, but if I wanted him to pay for it, it was going to have to be Princeton. So he thought that was funny, and I got accepted. And
I think that's why they accepted you.
yes, I
You were
think
very
that's
blunt about it.
yes.
So what did you want to study there? Still, you were
I was
interested in writing?
I was interested in English. I was interested in writing. I had a very good friend who is now a very famous writer, Gary Snyder, and I was interested in that. And but as I say, the English department talked me out of it.
Very interesting. But here goes very important question. During your education, you look like to have a very good family background with a lot of attention on your education. You learn French in the elementary school. It's very rare. Did you know anything about Korea, the location or the history or any culture, anything? Be honest, please.
Almost nothing. And that was characteristic of the country in general, as I don't need to tell you. However, there were two lamps on side tables next to the fireplace that were carved figures of Koreans. And they
What
made,
fireplace are you talking about?
pardon me?
What fireplace are you talking about?
My home.
Oh, your home, yeah.
And it made me curious. They had been given to my mother by her father, who had brought them back when he returned in 1929. And she honored them and had them on these two tables. So what little I knew of Korea came from questions I asked about why they dress this way and so forth. But that was it.
That's it. Nobody taught you during your school. You are one of the most top elite students getting into Princeton University, and you didn't know anything about Korea.
I don't need to tell you that the United States, for almost all of its history, and I would include today, very insular.
Yeah, very U.S.-centered perspective.
Right. We didn't see Asia as important to us, any part of it. The thing that was important to us was what academics saw as the important background that was affecting our culture, and that was European. The best food was French. The best manners were English, et cetera, et cetera. But Asia was something beyond our reach.
But except China and Japan. Japan attacked us, Pearl Harbor, in
But
1941.
you know,
China is so
we didn't
big.
know much about Japan. All of a sudden, this country has attacked us. We started to learn about Japan. But I can tell you that it was, for a youngster at that age, it was out of reach.
And when did you leave Korea as a Korean War veteran? You were there in late 1951, and then you left 1952?
Yeah, I 51, 52, I left with 60 points. That would roughly 15 months.
15 months, right.
Roughly, it's
So it's
hard for
gotta
me
be
to reconstruct it.
Early 1953, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, so have you been back to Korea after that?
No,
You never?
never.
Oh. Do you know what's going on in Republic of Korea, the South Korea, in
I-
terms of economy and
I have two sources of information that keep me vaguely up to date. Obviously, there's been a good deal of publications about what's been happening. And I have Patrick, who has been very, very good about telling me about his relationship with you and with others, and also about Korea itself. And you might say, well, why didn't you go back? I didn't not go back for any reason. I just have had no reason to go back. I am not sentimental, but I must say that I'm hugely admiring of the Korean people, and so there would be nothing to keep me away.
do you know that Korean economy now? We don't have natural resources. We don't have drop of oil.
That's right.
We don't have any real resources that matters to the economy. All most of it in North Korea. And do you know where the Korean economy ranked now?
Yes. One of the kinds of work that I did before retiring was planning, and often national planning. That is, growth control or growth encouragement. Now, the thing that took me to Puerto Rico was the understanding that Puerto Rico, at the moment that I graduated from graduate school, was the model for developing countries. And like Korea, there were no natural resources. Hence, they made a good comparison. And it was interesting to see the difference. And we could explore that, but I don't think that's on your schedule of questions.
Korea, with the size of a little bit bigger than the state of Indiana,
Right.
you've been there.
Right,
Now it's the 11th largest economy in the world.
I know.
Can you believe that?
And that speaks of the Korean people themselves. It also, one of the most extraordinary things, was the adoption of democracy and capitalism, but to suit Korea, not copying the United States, but learning. It was a lesson for every developing country in the world.
Very good. That's why we are working with your son to get more facts out of it from your legacy
Yes,
on Korea for our future generation.
absolutely.
I really think of this relationship perfect. You fought for us, your son working for us to get your legacy out there. So this is perfect reunion. And the Korean democracy is so vibrant. So that
Yes.
we know, the Koreans know, I'm US citizen, Koreans know how to impeach the president and put them into prison. So we have to learn from them
Yeah.
about whenever we need it, right? I don't want to make a...
Well, think of
anyway,
it.
Yeah, go ahead.
You might think of it the way I think of it. It's a stress test.
So when you left Korea, had you ever imagined that Korea would become like this today? When you left Korea in 1953 as a Korean War veteran soldier, had you imagined that Korea would become like this today? 11th largest economy in the world, most vibrant democracy in East Asian region. Had you ever imagined that?
If you had interviewed me at that time, I would have said no. But I was
Why?
well, I was a young man, and so I had had little experience. But what I observed was the influence of a deep and abiding culture that resulted in very strongly held ideas about morality, about manners, about empathy, about many things. Those were built in to the point that it would be difficult for a young man to imagine that that could ever change to something more dynamic as Korea became. It wouldn't have occurred to me. There was something primitive about Korea in my day, and you have a tendency to think that will last forever.
Tell me your first honest impression of Korea when you landed in Seoul for the first time. Be honest, be brutally honest about it. What was your impression of Korean people, landscape, whatever?
I try to be honest, so you don't have to encourage me. But the point is a difficult one for me to answer. First of all, I have to say I'm highly visual. And what I stood on deck as the craft that had picked us up in Japan was carrying us, I think, to Seoul, as I remember.
Were you airplane? Was it airplane or?
No, that was a boat, a ship.
From Yokohama?
From Yokohama, yes.
To where? Not
Seoul.
directly Seoul, no. You gotta be either in Incheon or Busan.
Well, I don't know.
How long was your truck to Seoul from the point where that you landed?
I'm not sure it was overnight.
Right, that must be in Incheon.
Okay.
Okay.
And so I was essentially transfixed with the topography. I could be wrong about this, but I remember karst geology. Is that correct?
What is it?
Karst, K-A-R-S-T in English. It's we call it a haystack hill. Mm-hmm. They're like small mountains you have those on that coast, huh?
Yep.
That caught me. I had never seen it before. And so my first impression was visual, very strongly visual. Landing, we were immediately taken up in the activities of the Army to get the replacements up to their positions. And so trucks picked us up wherever we landed, and we ended up in tents. And so there was nothing to be seen. We were occupied with Army things. I had no contact with Korean people at that point, and so was not in any way involved with the country as a country. I was only involved with the fact that I was about to go to war.
But you were able to visit Seoul before you left Korea. So
Yes.
when you saw the Seoul, how was it?
Seoul was a city that I might have expected to find in rural America. No tall buildings that I remember. The business section was primitive in my American viewpoint, but I found people accommodating and welcoming, and it was a pleasant tourist type trip.
Do you know that Seoul City, the capital city of Korea, is now one of the 10 biggest metropolitan cities in the world? It's
I
bigger,
do know
much
that,
bigger
yes.
than Manhattan, obviously.
I do though. And I find it astonishing. It's breathtaking. But the most breathtaking thing relative to that I have heard, was something that Patrick told me. When I asked him why you had any interest in this subject, and he said that there was a desire on the part of your government to have the soldiers that had participated in the Korean activity see the fruit of their sacrifice. That spun me, and it still does. I don't know, and I'm not a historian, but I don't know of another thing that I have ever heard of a country saying that way. And that defines much of what I think of as the Korean point of view.
Despite such configuration, it's almost like a miracle. They say it's a miracle in the Han River. If you're looking at the Korea in 1950 to right now, it's just unbelievable transformation.
Two completely different
Right.
environments.
But one thing that has never changed is that there's no much about Korean topics in our history curriculum.
Yes.
You told me that you never learned anything about Korea in your high school days.
Right.
Not in Princeton, obviously. And Patrick knows, your son knows that the current curriculum in AP World History, there was no topic whatsoever about Korea
Right.
until 2 years ago.
That's right.
Can you believe that?
It's extraordinary, don't you think?
Why? Can you explain to me?
I can't explain it. Other than my original remark with regard to the sense of isolation that Americans have always had. It's part of our history, part of our makeup, that we see the world as something out there, but we're here. And don't worry about that. That's Asia.
Mm-hmm. And it's for me, as originally from South Korea, it's almost like make me angry about it, because 37,000 approximately the American soldier killed in action, still missing in action. A lot of them also wounded. 2 million people, civilian and military, killed Korean people. And then such a transformation, and we don't teach about it. It's to me, it's almost like a mystery. What do you think?
I agree.
Huh?
I couldn't agree with you more.
So that's why we are doing this. And can you show that to camera? To your chin, yes. And what does it say? Can you read it?
Korea's place in teaching world history. It's a wonderful title because it begs a question.
And one of the writer of that book, which was published by the NSS and my foundation,
Yes.
is your son. Can you go to the first 2 pages, see if you can find his name and read it for me?
I love it. I don't know where to look here. It says what it is a publication, but I don't see the credits.
Anyway, your son's name is there, okay?
It's got a forward. It's got a forward. Are the credits after the forward? I see your name. You're all over the place.
Anyway, I am so honored, and this is kind of my dream come true, that we were able to write on 2 topics being added to the AP World History curriculum by the College Board and with your son.
Yes.
So I am so thankful about this
But
opportunity.
I admire the fact that this was an issue to you.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That's what changes the world.
And that's why we are working with the social studies teachers. We just finished the workshop in Orlando with the AP Human Geography. And the book that I gave you, my book, is about those. So we are going to produce another book like that for AP Human Geography. And we'll go beyond that and working on U.S. government, U.S. history, any subject that Korean topic can be a part of it, we will work on it. Your son will continue to work with us. And your son been to Korea more than many times that you've been, and he's going to be with us for our program where the 30 history teachers will make a
Wonderful.
visit to see what's happened after the war that you fought for.
Thank you for being nice to our son.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure. Let's go back to your military career. So, why did you quit the Princeton University? And why did you decide
Why
to go
did I
into
quit Princeton?
And why did you decide to go to war where that you might kill yourself?
Okay. First of all, let me say that there are two kinds of answers to that question. One is a practical. The other one is more subjective. There's a very practical, straightforward, principal reason. It was a GI Bill. I wanted to get out of Princeton, and the GI Bill would pay for my education.
You were kind of a silver spooner, right?
Kind of what?
Silver spooner. You had a very powerful father. He was
Yeah.
able to pay your tuition, right?
No.
Why not?
He was alcoholic and broke.
Really, by the time?
Yes. And I was an incredible burden, particularly on my mother. And that was part of my inability to adjust to Princeton, was my discomfort of being such a drain on a half-empty glass. And when it came to my junior year, it sort of all came home. I wasn't doing well. I didn't feel comfortable there, but I was sore in my heart over what I was doing to them. Not that I could go to them and say that, because they were not the kind who would pay much attention to anything I would say like that. So I decided that, yeah, the Army would pay for my education. Now, I probably wouldn't be able to get back into Princeton, but I felt at least I could finish my education with that money. Now, to go to the subjective side of that, I wasn't fearful of it. Because, remember, I was a boy during the Second World War. Soldiers were my heroes. And so it wasn't something that I ran from. That's
so you
one.
were not afraid?
I was not afraid. And another subjective aspect of it, which I have mentioned, is that, and this is typical, I think, of people at that age, I wanted to test myself. I wasn't making it at Princeton. I wanted to test myself. And so it was a very, very good decision for me to have made.
And you went to boot camp in Seattle, right? Was
No,
it Seattle?
no.
Or was it...
I was inducted in Seattle. I mean, it was just a matter of their geography, but I took a train from there to the middle of California, where a major Army training camp.
Was it Camp
Was-
Roberts?
Yes, San Robles. And that was called a pipeline. In other words, the people that were being trained there were just going straight to Korea. You really had to know the President of the United States to get out of that. And so that didn't particularly bother me.
Oh, before I forget, there is a Korean War veteran. I mean, he passed away. His name is Glenn Page, Glenn, last name Paige. He was the
You told me about it.
Yes, Princeton student. He volunteered for the Korean War. He was in the early phase, so he went to Pyongyang when MacArthur's Incheon landing successful and went up to the Pyongyang. And later he became a very famous political scientist. He wrote the book called Korean Decision, analyzing how President Truman actually reached to a conclusion to send the U.S. soldiers to Korea. And I had an interview of him from Hawaii, and he created Center for Non-Killing based on his killing during the war, and that's the question that my daughter asked him. You created this, founded this Center for Non-Killing after you kill a lot there in Korea. How does that make up to you? And he was almost like fond of my daughter. So I want you to look at that interviews in our digital archive, which is www.kwvdm.org, and see if you can identify him as a sort of acquaintance or not. That's one thing that I wanted to talk. So tell me about boot camp days. How did you like? What was your favorite? What was the thing that you hated most? Or how was it?
Well, it's a complicated question, of course, because it's a very different world, and one finds oneself adjusting to it. And as a result of a friendship that I had in Portland, a man who was drafted at the same time I was and was on the train that came from Seattle.
Turk?
Yes, Turk Adams. Turk was a rebel with a capital R. He would not shy from anything that was either dishonest or illegal. And he found me on the train, and we immediately sort of cleaved together as the only two people that knew anybody else. And we went together into the same platoon, and we spent the next few months using our imagination in any way that we could to avoid doing anything. And we were quite successful at it. We went AWOL every weekend, and we disobeyed when it was useful and obeyed when it was useful, and generally dismissed the whole affair, except he fell in love with machine guns. I had no particular interest in any of it. And so that it was a time that went fairly rapidly. I was not uncomfortable with it at any point. Much of my boyhood had been spent in the mountains. I was not unused to being outdoors. I was not weak, and so it was really quite an exciting time because of Turk and another friend who we made, who had been in the Dutch Merchant Marine, and he was a hard-bitten veteran of getting away with things. And
his name Nick?
Nick Hugendam. And Nick and Turk and I just did whatever we thought we would get away with. And but at the last minute, Turk and I decided to sign up for leaders course. Why they let us in, I don't know. And they kicked him out right away, and almost kicked me out. But that finished the time, and when that was done, I got a couple of weeks to go home, and then it was boarding a ship to sail across the ocean.
It's very interesting. Almost every veterans tell me about marching and the food there and how they dislike the period. But you all talking about two men here, Turk and Nick.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Well, if you're a mountaineer, you're used to bad food. I mean, gee whiz. You don't make an issue out of it. That's just part of the adventure. You're used to fools. That's part of the adventure. Don't make an issue out of that. Go find something to do.
Tell me about the troop ship that you were in. How was it?
Terrible. One of the worst experiences of my life.
Give me the details, please, including throw-ups and so on. Seasick.
As you may know, the troops are held below deck in an area that is divided into bunks that are, I think, 6 high and not very far apart, something on the order of 18 inches. And it was December, the water was not calm, and men were getting seasick everywhere. In their bunks, walking up the ladders to the deck, everywhere, just vomit everywhere. So you can imagine what it was like. But I had become so trained in, what would you say, disobedience, that the moment a chaplain asked for if there was anybody aboard that had radio experience, I was in his office in a wink, essentially inventing stories, and he asked me to read the news, and I got out of all of the details. I didn't have to clean up any vomit or work in the kitchen or do anything else. And
so you've been always lucky.
And all I had to do was read the news to the troops. In
the ship, you mean?
Pardon?
In the ship? In the ship, in the
Yes.
troop ship.
Troop ships, yes.
You read
The news.
news to the
We
soldiers.
had a teletype, and it just rolled out a sheet of news. I'd tear it off and read it over the mic. And so everybody was kept abreast. The chaplain felt,
What's his name? Waldy?
I have no,
Okay.
that was another chaplain, but this chaplain felt that it was important to the morale of the troops to be connected to their homes.
Yep.
And news was one way to do it.
So you were in the broadcasting company there in the ship.
And one of the most curious things happened because it was Christmas time. He wanted to put on a Christmas show. And so he turned to another fellow and I that he had asked to do this kind of thing and said, "You're professionals, you put on the show." Well, I had never had anything to do with being on the stage or shows or anything like that. And but we cobbled something together. I decided to do a stand-up comedy routine. And it had a whole bunch of dirty jokes that I knew that the troops would adore. And
Can you repeat that?
pardon?
Can you repeat that, some portion of it?
Those dirty jokes? No,
Yeah,
I'm not going to
yeah.
repeat them.
Okay.
But
I accept your refuse.
but the problem was that he expurgated all of them. He made me, do a review of what I was going to say. So I had to take jokes from his joke book, which was bad, and but we were well received by the Navy and by some wives that were being taken over to Japan, but the troops on Christmas Eve were having none of it. And there was just a big
So tell me about that. I read your script and says that there were about 20 wives of the officers who were
Yes.
headed to Japan.
Yes.
Ah,
And there were staterooms on this ship as well as the one that I came back on. And that's where they were. And they had their own mess, and it was a comfortable ride for them, I think. It's interesting that the Army was taking care of soldiers that were detailed to Japan in a regular Army sense, not just draftees going into combat.
as an architect, Japan is a very good case study, isn't it? I've been to Japan many times, and I love that the old architecture, you know,
Yes.
the real natural color of the wood with
Yes.
the copper, with the blue, you know,
Yes.
I just love it. What do you
Yes.
think?
I, of course, had some sense of Japanese architecture because I had studied it in history classes at Princeton. And I was a great admirer of it. And so when it came time to go to Japan, which was in those days called R&R, rest and recuperation, if you'd been in combat long enough, they'd let you go back and sort of relieve some of the stress. And we had a choice to go to Tokyo or to Osaka, and I decided to go to Tokyo because I was more interested in fun than I was architecture. But I was interested in architecture.
What was your unit?
The 5th Regimental Combat Team was a part of the 24th Division. The Regimental Combat Team is not quite the same as a regiment, an infantry regiment, because it is specifically structured to be independent if it were to get surrounded, for instance, and thus becomes a workhorse. It becomes the unit that the division will throw into a situation that's chancy. The 24th Division was stationed in Hawaii at the time of the opening of the Korean conflict, and the 5th was that regiment, and I was assigned to it. However, on the very first day that I was in that tent getting what was called advanced training, which was really an exercise in being terrified, I was asked if I might like to be a correspondent, and I did. And so I had a job that made me independent of any officer. I was answerable to none, although it was really answerable to all. But my job was simply to make up my mind what to write about this unit, because the American Army wanted the people, the mothers, the fathers, the sisters, and the brothers to hear about what was going on. But my point was never to write about the ugly things, but was to write about the people, what they were like and what they did. And so that's what I did, but I found it boring, and so I got the idea to write about Father Waldy, who was our chaplain. And I spent a great deal of time putting together an article about him because he was revered by our troops simply because he was always there when the bullets were flying.
Could you give his full name?
Nope. Father Waldy is the only thing I know. I probably at some time knew his first name. I couldn't have written about it without it, but I don't remember now. And Father Waldy dedicated himself to giving what Catholics refer to as extreme unction. That's the last moment of life in which you confess and you ask for forgiveness. And he would rush to a fallen soldier in ignoring the rounds that were flying around. And he was heroic and greatly revered. And so he made a good story. But eventually we were transferred to, catch me if I pronounce it correctly, Kojido.
Yeah.
And Kojido was an island off the southern coast.
But before we go into
Yes,
that
okay.
part, because that's also a very important part of your service,
Okay.
as long as I understand it, what was your original specialty rather than becoming a writer, where your dream actually realized? But what was your original specialty? Was you a machine
You mean
gunist?
what the Army had
Yeah,
assigned me to do? Nothing. I was a rifleman.
Rifleman, yes. And where were you? Where was that headquarters located? In the front line or where? In the west side?
Well,
or
the fifth was online when I joined them. Wait a minute, let me correct that. No, the fifth was not online when I joined them. They were in reserve in the Punch Bowl. Does that ring a bell with you?
Yes.
And we were down in the Punch Bowl, sort of licking our wounds, and that's where I started out as a correspondent. And we moved from there up to the line in a position that I should remember the name of the nearest city or something, but I don't. If you know where the Turks were, that's where we were next door to them when we went up online.
Yes. Tell me about your experience with the Turks.
With the Turks?
Not your friend, but...
No, I never think of him as a Turk. The Turks were extraordinary. They were so much different as an army. First of all, they never wore any insignia. That was wise, in a sense. It doesn't give the enemy an opportunity to shoot the captain. But also the discipline was odd. They didn't call somebody down for doing something, they just slapped him. And that was quite foreign to an American soldier. They drove jeeps and trucks, but they didn't, many of them, know how to drive. So they would get people to put it in second, and they never went out of second. They couldn't back up, they couldn't do anything else but drive it in second. And so they'd come into the CP with their motors, going to pot, and come into the CP and talked about coordinating. And they were probably, in my view, the most ferocious of our side of the line. The North Koreans were the most ferocious of their side of the line. And I believe the Turks were facing the North Koreans. That's my vague memory. But it was a very steep valley at that point. There was a ridge and a rather steep valley, and the ridge on the other side came close to our ridge. And so they were all in bunkers with just little slits that they looked out of and shot through. And they just, at some moment, got sick of it, and a whole bunch of them grabbed their weapons and come up out of their bunkers and down the hill and up the other one, shoot everybody up and run back. It was just you just shook your head and couldn't believe that anybody would do that. I mean, it was facing death in an instant.
That's tough.
And at least that's the way I remember it. And so it teaches you something about human beings. Mm-hmm. And it's a quality that is beyond comprehension for an American.
Going back to your correspondence job,
Yes.
did you like it?
Oh, yes. I was so privileged. I had my own tent. Can you imagine when we were in reserve? I had a houseboy. God, he did nothing else but bring me my breakfast and roll up my sleeping bag and sweep up the tent. That was his entire responsibility. He was a wonderful guy. I really liked him. He had, as I had
He was
described
very
it-
old.
Pardon?
He was very old.
Yeah, well, I think he was in his 40s. He could have been older. He might have been 50s, you know.
So he was not houseboy. He was house
No, he was no
adult.
houseboy. He was one of those guys that got conscripted to carry ammunition, and
Oh,
he figured
okay.
out a way to do this. And they probably let him do it because it was hard work. That ammunition business was really tough. And
But do you remember any writing of yours? Anything?
no, I don't. You know, you have to understand me. I'm really an existentialist. It goes in the waste paper basket the next day.
But what do you mean by being a correspondent? Were you writing for newspaper or what were you doing actually? And who
I was
used
writing
that information?
Yeah, I understand your question. There was a channel. You wrote it and you put it in the channel, and the channel was the Public Information Office of the United States Army, PIO as it's called, and
So you belong to the Public Information
right.
Office.
So I didn't place the articles; they placed the articles.
So have you then served as a frontline soldier, foot soldier, fighting and shooting against this enemy ever in your service?
Well, yes and no.
Tell me, please.
We spoke of Cogito. When we came back from Cogito, I was no longer in the PIO because there had been a news blanket on anything coming out of Cogito. It was secret. It wasn't secret from our enemies. Only really secret from the rest of the Americans.
Why?
Why? Because the North Koreans and Chinese had really very good intelligence. Mm-hmm. It wasn't something that was difficult because who would easily know whether someone was South Korean or North Korean if he was an American? So we had our spies that went over the line, and they had their spies that went over the line, and we both knew what the others were doing. So they knew when we went to Cogito, because they'd had a week to make a big banner that say, "Welcome butchers of wherever it was we came from."
Bakers.
Yeah. And likewise, we had a banner like that on the line when we went back on the line. So there was a lot of intelligence that was getting transferred. There were no secrets that the enemy. Furthermore, they had a guy who flew a small Cessna plane. He was called Bed Check Charlie, because Bed Check Charlie would go over about 5 o'clock in the evening. And he was radioing back, well, there are 5 tanks there and they got some, blah, blah, blah. So it was kind of open in a way that many wartime situations wouldn't be quite that open. I imagine it was even worse in Vietnam, where the intermixing of people. So I was no longer writing. I now went into using my skill with maps. As a mountaineer, I was very good with maps. And so that was useful. And so they put me in the headquarters company, and I just kind of went up the line with different jobs, but no longer writing.
Was it in the Punchbowl again?
Say that?
Was that the Punchbowl again when you returned from Goje Island?
No, it wasn't.
Do you remember where? Any name? East, west, orientation?
It was further east. It was still in the center part. We weren't on the coast.
Okay, so
I'm not sure whether that was a position where the Turks were on our left and the Puerto Ricans were on our right. It could have been. Would you know?
yeah, we'll be able to tell. Yes.
Yeah, does that sound like it's further east of the
Yes,
center?
yes.
Okay. Well, that would probably be it. Further east than the Punchbowl. Yeah.
What was your rank at the time?
At what time? It
when
was
you were-
constantly changing.
When you were in Punchbowl as a correspondent,
Oh, I arrived in the Punchbowl at PFC.
PFC.
And I think I was immediately given the rank of corporal because I was a correspondent.
What a private first class with his own office and his own
Yes.
secretary.
It was marvelous.
Yeah.
And my houseboy would bring me a meal and put it on it was wonderful.
Do you think we can retrieve some of your writings from old newspaper or anything?
No, it's gone.
It's gone. That's too bad. I think that should be
No,
your
it may
son's
be a
job.
blessing. It may be a blessing.
So that Patrick doesn't read it, right?
No, he'll never read it. Thank God.
Any dangerous moment during your service in Punchbowl as a correspondent? Not really, right?
Well, everybody, not as a correspondent, no. I did a couple of things that other people would have described as dangerous, but in fact were not. One of the things that I got in mind was going on a patrol. I was asked to carry the radio, and I was so loud in using it that I ruined the patrol, and I never got to do that again. And
That's the best way to get away from it, right?
yeah. Well, in those days you wore the radio on your back.
You
It
are
was a
the
big
target.
thing like that. And I'm sitting there saying, Butcher, Butcher, this is Baker. And the corporal is saying they can hear that over the next mountain. And so that was the end of that. But it might have been dangerous, if we'd gotten into a scuffle. And I went out to a forward observer
Yes,
post, which
yeah.
had a company.
That's
We
very dangerous.
Put that company out there. Well, it was like a mile and a half, maybe 2 miles. No, more like a mile maybe. But anyway, out there. And I went because it was Chinese New Year's and the big deal in the year before. I thought there might be something worth writing about. And nothing happened. So my dangers never materialized.
Did you know what were you doing there?
Did I know what?
Did you know what you were doing there
Oh,
in
yeah.
Korea? What were you doing? What did you think that you were doing at the time?
What did I think I was
Yeah.
doing?
Yeah, you were doing there in Korea.
What did I think? Oh, I see. You mean in a sort of political sense or in a military sense?
Right.
I was well aware of the principle of containment that controlled the American point of view, and that there was a serious containment leak.
That's a very, very funny way to describe it, but it's really get to the point.
So it seemed to me a reasonable thing to do. I thought the containment was a bright idea. I still do. The United States has placed itself all around the world in order to protect the United States. And so that may be the center of your question. An American fighting in Korea wasn't fighting for South Korea as much as he was fighting for his own country. He wasn't there as a, what should I say, a generous soul to help a country that needed it. He was there because his country needed it. Now, I don't think that makes us, as good as you might like to think of us, but that is a fact.
That's a great point. But did that change when you were there actually fighting? That idea, that thinking, did that change when you were there actually fighting there for 15 months? Did that change? Do you understand what I'm...
Well, yes, you make a point. It's one that I haven't given much thought to. But I think the answer is yes. And I think the reason the answer is yes is that by the time I left, I had Korean contacts. I had lived with a Korean girl when we were stationed in Kojido. And I had houseboys that became friends, really. I was constantly in contact with Koreans because later on I became used to interrogate and that sort of thing. And so Korea as a place might not have been as important to me as Korea as a people. And what I took home was that. It was incidents that have stayed with me all my life. I'll recount one of them to give you an idea, but why somebody might feel that way. When we were in in Kojido, I asked a houseboy if I could rent a house. And he says, yes, I know of a house. I was so good at going AWOL by this time, highly trained in my boot training, that I just simply went into the village without anybody knowing it. And my houseboy arrived and he took me to a house. And you have, in the old days, these wonderful houses that had a courtyard, very similar to the Japanese form, with two sides that faced on to the little courtyard and walls, and a man dressed in traditional Korean white vestments, if that's the right word.
Traditional garment.
Came in and bowed to me as if I were a king, and we sat, and the houseboy kind of acted as an interpreter, and he brought a box, and he handed it to me. And the houseboy says he wants to know if you can figure out how to open it. Now, I'm an architect. That's the kind of thing I really get into. So I fiddled with it, and I figured it out, and I opened it and handed it back to him open. and he made gestures of admiration, and we went on with our conversation of how much it was going to cost to rent his house. And
That's
what
very interesting. Why do you think that he asked you to open this box?
beats me, it was just a gesture of friendship, like a way of making
But
a
out
connection.
of that, it just ignited the relationship, right?
Yeah.
Huh.
I mean, you know, it was a kind of thing that impresses you. You ask yourself that question, why did he do that? And the only explanation was that he was making a simple gesture to say, look, this is fun, we can share this. It's a way of sharing something hard to do with somebody who can't speak his language, doesn't have culture that you can admire, so forth. Now, I went away with that, and I went back and I thought about it for days, whipping myself for not keeping it secret that I knew his secret. That had I been Korean, I probably would have handed it back to him unopened and saying, that's too difficult for me.
Yeah.
That would have been the Korean way to respond to it, but not me. I got to open it up and make something of myself. And so you can see what I'm getting at. I was learning something. I was learning about me. I was learning about Koreans. I was expanding my understanding of people.
And so that introduction, what that introduction led to in Kojedo?
What did that introduction lead to?
With the
I rented
store.
his house.
And
Well, it was a girl. I had asked the houseboy if were there any girls that would like to live with me for a couple of 3 weeks. And he said, yeah. And her name was Okja.
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 Am I pronouncing it correctly?
Yes, correct.
And Okja was young, same age as me, maybe a year or two older, I don't know. She couldn't speak English, I couldn't speak Korean, but somehow we were able to communicate. And we ended up liking each other a lot. And so I would, at nighttime, sneak out and go over there. I didn't eat there. I tried to bring food for her and her friends. But I would spend the night there and then get up in the morning. Well, it got to be so that the MPs would welcome me and I could walk right through the gate.
AWOL, right?
Yeah, I was a sergeant by that time. I said, good morning, Sergeant. And but it turned out that there were 2 other sergeants who were doing the same thing. We didn't know it until after a while.
But going back to my original question, how did that relationship with Okja actually change your view about why you were there and what you were doing there?
Well,
and how did it affect you?
I'm skirting the question perhaps because I don't know that there's an answer to that. It changed my understanding, but of people and the Korean culture, but it did not change my understanding of the political reason for being there. I was there not because I chose to be there. I was there because I chose to get the VA money for education. And I don't think I ever made the leap that you're asking, where I changed how I felt about why I was there because of something that people revealed to me. That didn't occur to me.
You told me that you never been back to Korea after you left Korea as a Korean War veteran. But your story tells me something very different. I never heard of this kind of story from the veteran. What is Korea to you, even though you never been back to Korea? But from that, looking back all those years, you never know anything about Korea. What is Korea to you now, personally?
You want adjectives or nouns?
Both, and verb too.
Well, I'll start with adjectives. Heroic, embattled, empathetic in a way that is surprising. I would, shifting to nouns, say that what has happened to South Korea is exemplary of the human capacity to make lemonade out of lemons. Now, as a historian, your interest in such a subject, Korea, any other place, is a little different than my non-historian preoccupations. And so I don't create an image for Korea, I just admire it. And the modern Korea probably, in my suspicion, has taken on many of the negatives of the American experience. Overbuilding, focus on wealth, or I could go on. But that doesn't concern me. That isn't the point. The point is that the average life in Korea is now so much better than it was when I got there, that that's worthy of applause for no other reason.
Excellent point. Tell me about Gojedo. I know Gojedo, but for the audience, thinking that many young students will listen this interview, where is Gojedo and what were you doing there? What are you talking about Goje?
Okay. Gojedo is an island and it is off the southern tip of Korea. It was occupied by the Americans to use as a prison. The prison was divided into compounds where prisoners that were North Koreans, enlisted men in one compound, officers in another, Chinese in another, Chinese officers in another, and so forth. The compounds were essentially tents contained within a fence and guarded by soldiers. The soldiers never entered the compounds. They were run by the occupants by themselves. Food
North
was
Koreans and Chinese.
yes.
North.
And the compound that was nearest where the 5th RCT was billeted was the North Koreans. And it was the most rambunctious, in fact, brutal compound. They were actually executing their fellow prisoners for minor crimes. And they sang the Internationale every night, every evening. I guess it was in the morning. It was really quite something to hear. It's a marvelous piece of music. And, but there was an ugliness that seemed somehow to justify all the ugliness that we were seeing on the line. After I left, a foolish, I think it was a general officer, went into the compound, and the North Korean compound, I think it was, and they encircled him and
Yeah.
brought him in, and they had to negotiate his
Release.
removal. So it was a tough place. But around this was farming land, much of it rice paddies, and little villages. And it was one such village where I rented a house. And we were simply there standing guard. There's nothing easier. And then we all went back up in landing craft to the line when our time was up.
What did you do there? Did you continue to write about?
I couldn't write anymore, so I was no longer a correspondent. And as I said, they took me into the map-making section of the, I should explain something you probably know, but the 4 divisions of the Army involved, 2 of them, one of them is command and one of them is intelligence. They often are together in the same bunker or tent or whatever, and so I was in intelligence, but I was making maps you need them to place a weapon and know where it is. And then we went back up online, and by this time I think I was a staff sergeant, a major buck sergeant. There was a man who was the operations sergeant of one of the battalions. Battalions, yeah. And he needed a replacement, and they asked me to do it. So what I was doing when I was in Kojiter was making maps.
Wow. Making maps.
Well, not really drawing them from the beginning, but I would take a map and I would have to copy it and I'd have to arrange it, I'd have to figure out.
Oh, I see.
And it was surprising to me how many Americans are illiterate at maps. They just looking at lines and they couldn't tell where they were. And topographical maps read 3-dimensionally to me.
So you were able to read those things instantly.
Yeah.
That's great. What was the most difficult thing, if I ask you to pinpoint among many others, throughout your whole duration in Korea as a Korean War?
Most difficult thing?
Yeah, or thing that you hated or anything, just one.
Well, guys in the Army can give you a bushel bag through those. But one of them had to do with interviewing a woman who was a prostitute. She was on the other side of a river when we got to, before we went up to that last ridge. And she was sitting in front of an American flag that had been displayed in a tent, and I was asking her why she was there and where she had come from and who else was there and so forth. And the soldiers were getting across the river, and an officer who had just come up from what is it, the university where officers are trained. I'll think of it in a minute. What?
West Point?
West Point, thank you. He just come up from West Point, and he was a strong patriot, and he had an anger fit. It horrified me. I was feeling so sorry for this old woman. I mean, she was really old. And another incident that was ugly, like that, was a general responding to a call on the radio from a forward observer that artillery shells had wiped out a patrol that he had called in, sighted, and the general jumping up and down, and when the forward observer screamed into the radio, "Murder," that twisted me. That was ugly. And I sound like somebody sensitive to this kind of thing, and I quite frankly am. And
More like a rebel, you know?
yeah.
Yeah.
And another incident was a gangster who was trying to get me off the line.
From?
Well, he, there are a lot of guys that get into the military just to get out of the court system. And he was what is called a first sergeant. First sergeant, you remember my mentioning of the 4 parts of the military. One of them is personnel. The guy in charge of the personnel, the non-commissioned, highest ranking non-commissioned guy, would be the first sergeant, and he's the first among all.
Yeah.
So he outranked me, not by very much. And we got into a kind of a tussle over whether my men would stand inspections and stuff like that. And I told him absolutely not. And so he decided to just rotate me back to the United States because I had spent more time. You only have to have 40 points
Points,
to,
right.
and I had 60. So
You had a 60 point.
I
Right?
think it
Yeah,
was 60.
yeah.
But, and my whole point was I didn't want to do barracks work when I got back. I wanted to get out. And so he tried to get rid of me, and I had one of those ugly personal battles. But I didn't really face the kind of horror that a frontline soldier faces in combat. It could have happened, it didn't happen. It's just as simple as that.
Here we go. Would you please introduce yourself? What is your name?
I'm Sydney Whelan,
Sydney. S-Y-D.
S-I-D.
S-I-D-N-E-Y. Sydney. And you are?
the wife of Jack Whelan.
Jack. Okay. And in the middle?
Sure. I'm Patrick Whelan. I'm the youngest son of Jack Whelan and Sydney Whelan.
And what do you do?
I'm a teacher, and so I teach at St. Stephen's Episcopal School in Bradenton, Florida, and I teach world history.
World history. No wonder why you are working with me, right?
That's right.
But I have a question to ask you to Sydney. When did you know of him? For
When
the
did-
first time, yes.
I met him just before he went to Korea,
Just before? Tell me how.
and it was a blind date. You know what a blind date is? You don't know who you're going to meet. They just,
Exactly.
yeah. And
Who arranged that?
we just really hit it off, and I think I was second year in college, maybe first year in college. I was about 18.
Where
and-
were you?
18 years old,
I mean, where were you?
in Boston.
Boston. So what college you were in?
I was at Pine Manor Junior College,
Ah,
and then I graduated from the University of Michigan, because I'm from Michigan.
ah,
And
very good school.
yes, and in education, I'm a school teacher. And
I
taught
wonder where you are coming from.
I taught kindergarten and nursery school in Boston and Puerto Rico, and in Detroit. And
Tell me about Jack first, Jack, that you had in your memory.
yeah, so
Were you attracted to him?
I really liked him at first.
Why?
Because he was really interesting, he was very different than other people. He was 2.5 years older than I was, and he talked about skiing and all these things that kind of, I thought that was kind of neat. You know, that he
Cool.
was a mountain climber and a skier and mountain patrol, ski patrol, all that kind of thing out west. And so I only knew him for 3 dates before he went to Korea.
Oh boy.
Boy, but he never wrote because he thought that maybe he wouldn't be coming back, and he wanted me to grow up and live my life, and he came back, then he would look me up, and he did look me up.
But even though it wasn't marriage or any engagement or anything,
Oh, no,
just
no.
3 days
Yeah.
of blind date,
3 blank, yeah.
but must be kind of hard to you, was it?
It was hard for him to go away because I really
No,
liked
no, no,
him.
for you,
Oh,
not to see him.
how hard was it for me not to see him? Very hard, but then I started dating other people because he was gone.
Good for you.
You know, I didn't, and he wanted me to do that.
So, let me ask you, Jack, why didn't you write the letter to her? Did you like her at the time?
I think more than I've ever liked anyone.
Then I'm getting more curious that you didn't write to her.
Well, she just gave the reason. I thought it was wise to break it off. And the only way you break it off well is to break it off. The reason I thought it was wise is what was the percentage that I would survive? I don't know how high it was or how low it was. But I wasn't going to take a chance that she would have to come down to the airport and welcome my box. So that was the reason. Now, it didn't mean that I loved her less. I was very lonely thinking of her. But I couldn't do that to her. That wasn't fair.
Were you thinking of her while you were in Korea?
Oh, sure. All the time. But the point is that it's not fair. It's you don't have 3
You're
dates.
saying like a judge, you know.
Pardon?
You're saying like a judge.
Yeah.
You should have been yourself, writing letters and crying for her, and then finally, but very interesting.
No, I figured, well, if she's still around when I get back, I'll look her up.
And so what happened when you came back? Did you?
I did.
What did you do?
Didn't work.
What did you do?
I went up to see her in Boston and she kicked me out.
No,
Really?
he grew up like 7 years and was really tough. I grew up like 3 minutes in that time, and he was just like scary. And so I discouraged it.
And then?
And then I didn't see him at all. And then I graduated from the University of Michigan, and I remember thinking, I wonder whatever happened to Jack Whelan. And so I looked him up at Princeton, and it clicked right away. So I knew him 7 years, and we've been married 63.
When did you marry?
When did we get married? 56.
56. Here's a question. Did he share any war experience
No.
with you?
No.
No? See, that's why the war become forgotten. Because you don't talk. You are responsible for that nickname.
No, we never talked about it. He's never really talked about it.
You know, there's no point making a mess out of.
Do you know anything about Korea, the country that he fought?
Not really.
Not really.
Not really.
Do you know anything about Korea now?
No,
Not really.
not really.
That's why we need to do more
Yeah.
of this, okay?
Yes, exactly.
So, Patrick, tell
Yes.
me, did he ever talk to you about the war? Ever?
I'll tell you that when my father was growing up, he knew very little about Korea. His grandparents had been to Korea, working on the railroad during the 1920s. And so he didn't know very much as a child, as most Americans didn't. I knew about Korea through my father, and it wasn't specifics about the war, but rather lessons that he had to say about issues of honor and issues of respect and issues of perseverance.
You don't have to beautify it
Right.
or anything.
No,
It looks
but-
like
but the stories that my father would say about those values, that oftentimes he would have an example from his experience in Korea, about the people that he worked with and so forth, who represented those values. And so my notion of Korea was as a place where my father had been, and a place that had those values. And that, and so he, as parents will do, they'll tell morality stories. And so some, not all, but some of those morality stories involved his time working with the Korean people.
as a history teacher, especially AP World History teacher, why do you think that the Korean War has been forgotten?
That's a good question, and I think that it's a misunderstanding that it, especially in the wake of World War II, that the Korean War was not seen as a complete victory. I think that in many ways it was a victory for the people who now live in the South. And I think that just as the Vietnam War that followed, that there was some ambiguity with the end of the war. There was not a peace treaty. There still has not been a peace treaty. There was an armistice. And so as a result of that unfinished aspect, the story was not told, because stories need to have an ending, and the Korean War has not had an ending.
Excellent point. Do you teach about Korea in your class?
Yes.
Tell me, please, what do you teach? And
As a teacher, I get to choose the examples that I want to choose, and Korea has become part of that. Not just Korea in the Korean War or the story of the Korean economic miracle, but some of Korean history before, to add context to East Asia. In the United States, if we teach about Asia and world history, its focus is mostly on China, to some extent on Japan. But I try to include some stories about Korean culture, especially King Sejong and the Korean alphabet, Korean metallurgy, the idea of Korean palace culture, and some of those aspects of Confucianism, Buddhism, and some of the belief systems that have been transmitted through Korean culture to other places.
are you going to Korea?
Yes.
Have you been to Korea?
I've been to Korea once, but
Once?
I'll be returning again this July to take part in a teaching fellowship that's sponsored by the World History Digital Education Group. And so I'll be joining 30 other people, educators from all across the country, and we'll be in mostly in Seoul, South Korea, also visiting the demilitarized zone and doing some work in schools, and also doing some investigation of religious culture in Korea and in temples and so forth.
It is the realities, not just the people that I know, but most of the Americans didn't have to pay attention to a small country, so-called Korea, until the war broke out. But
Yes.
even after the war broke out, we still don't teach about it, even though there are such, to me, it's a very important region in the world affairs right now. Our President Trump, Kim Jong-un, talking about denuclearization and building Trump Tower in Pyongyang, all these things. I think it captures the importance of the unfinished business of the Korean War. I want to ask you one more time. When you are watching your father's witness,
Yes.
right? And for a teacher who knows about Korea in 1950 and the Korea right now, the contemporary Korea, you
Yes.
know all of it. But from your perspective, when you hear from what your father's saying, what were you thinking? Anything that you want to share with us together?
Well, first of all, it's wonderful that he was so generous to share his time and his experience. He's a very open person, and you can tell in this story that his personality has really come through. Everything that he said today is very much in keeping with the way in which Jack Whelan has lived his life.
No, that's nice of you to say, Pat.
So that in thinking about his comments about Korea in particular, about this the issue of its transformation, this is something that's actually in that book that he showed, because it's a question that we ask students. Who is most responsible for this transformation? And in the exercise, we divide students into one group representing the government, another group representing the corporations, and a third group representing the Korean citizens themselves, and present them with documents and evidence, and they're to make that decision. And so I think that it's the, if you will, that that historical question that is not for me to answer, but rather for my students to answer. And I'm going to give them that the materials in which to make those judgments.
That's why I love your son. He's answering the way that I want it to be.
I have an addition, if I may.
Please.
You asked Sydney, had I told her war stories?
Yeah.
And I have a point of view, and I'd like to sort of pass it on. I believe that in a democracy, that when a soldier is conscripted to protect the nation, whatever the reason, he does his job and he is returned to citizenship. He takes off his uniform and he doesn't look back. He doesn't carry the horror of war into his home or the community or anything else. That it's done. And he's not asking for approbation. He's not asking for any kind of recognition. He's simply a citizen, has done his job.
So, from your perspective, Vietnam War is almost most of the kind of exceptional, right? Being treated here in our educational and curricular resources. Do you agree that?
I think a great deal of attention was on the Vietnam War because of the generation that was involved. The Korean War occurred so soon after World War II.
It had a lot to do with the fact that we knew what war was.
That's right. And that there were television cameras in Vietnam and widespread media coverage as it was happening. And so in the Korean War, as my father said, there were news blackouts. The material that my father wrote as a correspondent was heavily censored in a way that that it was not in the Vietnam War.
Are you proud to be a Korean War veteran?
Oh, yes, of course. Oh, yes. I am a pacifist, as all veterans of combat probably are. Few aren't. But I am proud that our country stood up to protect South Korea. And therefore, I can't help but be proud that I was part of it.
What do you think is the important legacy of the Korean War in general, independent of your personal service there?
Well, the legacy is the strength of South Korea. That's the legacy. We may also say that we did protect against the onrush of communism from the North. That's certainly part of the legacy. But in terms of what impresses one, it's South Korea.
Any other episode that you remember and wanted to share?
None that I would think of offhand. You stir the pot, all sorts of beans come whirling around, but I don't think about it a lot. It's not something that pervades my life view. It's just something like we all experience and took away.
Any other comments that you want to leave to this interview?
I think that wartime always causes damage, and it always has casualties that are both the physical casualties, the death, and the injuries, but also it leaves other damages as well. And one of the things that my father told me is that growing up is that that we should not rush into war, and that war is something always to be sad about, sometimes necessary, oftentimes not, but always something to be done with great seriousness, and that to treat the idea of the damage of war much more broadly than just the dead and the injured, but also to deal with those human issues that involve the civilians and those unrecognizable injuries that are not visible with the people who return.
Thank you again. It's a wonderful time that I had.
Thank
And
you.
I think there are many, many points that our young generation is learning from you.
It's been very exciting to talk to you, and I was impressed that you would even want to. But you've carried me back. You've made me feel that maybe I do have something to be proud of. And you may be a good example of that.
Wow. Thank you very much, sir. And thank you for your
Thank you.
service for the country that you didn't really know much about it, but now it demonstrates how valuable your service was.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.